about the intersection between augmented reality, virtual reality, immersive experiences, all of these technologies, which fundamentally have a big, by nature of being digital, kind of immaterial element to them, and they're kind of immaterial experiences, but at the same time, they're very materialized, as we saw today, in that you've kind of got these physical interfaces. And we want to think about the impact of these technologies on all the different fields and practices that have material culture at their core. So this is kind of the idea behind the network, because we're both archaeologists, and so we spend a lot of time thinking about how people shape and experience the world through material culture. We started thinking interesting and a bit weird that we've all kind of incorporated all of this digital immaterial stuff into our practice, and maybe we should start talking about what this means. And then we said, okay, so this isn't just an archaeology question, it's a games and game design question, it's an architecture question, it's an art question, it's a theater question. And so we're holding a series of events with practitioners and researchers from these different disciplines that engage with material culture to talk about some of these questions. And so we're really pleased and excited today to be in Abertay talking about how we play. Play being something that is both material and immaterial and really important and interesting socially. We play as kids and we play as adults, and it's how we meet each other. And there's a lot of ancient play. I won't get into the zone of ancient games, but we're really excited to be here today with this great panel of speakers. Gareth, did you want to add anything else about the network?
Well, maybe just say, I'd say really selfishly, we're really interested in, as archaeologists, in sort of tapping into all of that long-held expertise that game designers and game makers have in representing the world, trying to represent material things in digital media. It's something that we sort of recognise a real specialism in and really would love to know more about. So I think this is really one of the key conversations, and really excited to be here. So thank you for having us.
So I think we'll hand over to Robin to introduce the panel and the particular specifics of the event today.
Thank you. Okay, so hi everyone. We've already met earlier on today. So I'm Robin Sloan. I'm a lecturer here at Abertay in game design, computer arts, and everything in between. And many different things. I hope you've enjoyed coming to Abertay to talk about this. Obviously, we're known for computer games at Abertay University. We've been teaching, researching game design, game technology, game art for 22 years, if I can add that. So, the oldest institution in the world for teaching game design. But game design is really an interdisciplinary field, and what that really touches on is bringing together different creative and technical disciplines to create new meaning. So what we're doing within this network really is a natural extension of game design. So I think it's really appropriate what we're talking about here today. Now, what we really want to focus on today, part of this panel, is to think about what are the kind of lessons or the ideas or the concepts or the future trends that's coming largely from game design. And I use game design really broadly, and I think probably the panel will use game design very broadly. There won't be a particular thing or specific thing when they say that. What are the kind of ideas or concepts we could take from that and map on to new technologies, new screen technologies, new mixed reality technologies, but also the intersection between the physical and the digital, or the material and the immaterial. And to do this, we've got a really prestigious panel. Smiles first. There we go. So yeah, we have a really prestigious panel, but even though if they don't believe it themselves, very good collection, diverse collection of different voices, I think, that will come into this discussion from different angles. So firstly, to my left, I've got Dr. Louchart from Glasgow School of Art. I'm going to ask each person to give a brief introduction about their research just in a second. We've also got Bozdog, who's a lecturer in immersive experience design, so I guess that's really appropriate. I think you noted that immersive experience design is the first time someone's had that title potentially as a lecturer in the UK. I don't know if that's true or not, but you said that somewhere. Yeah?
Yes.
Yes, so it's true. It's true because you wrote it down.
I apologise.
We have Simon Meek, who's just recently finished his stint at the V&A as a designer in residence, but also of The Secret Experiment in Glasgow, and Lynn / Parker, depending whether you're using Dr. or Mrs. at the start. I think that's how it works. It's a Jekyll and Hyde type thing. And Lynn's a lecturer in computer arts, but more broadly does lots of different things around games in play. So I don't know if you each want to give a quick introduction about your current role and your research interests or practice interests. Yes, first, yeah.
Right. So I am I'm the head of undergraduate programs at the School of Simulation and Visualization at the Glasgow School of Art. It's a long one. So what I do there is I am working on developing undergraduate programs, at the moment mainly working on games and VR and 3D modeling. But I'm coming at it from a personal research interest as well. So for the last 18 years or so, I've been looking into interactive digital storytelling. And I looked at it from a very technical perspective initially, so from an artificial intelligence kind of perspective. And I realized moving forward with that research that there is a real gap and a real disconnect between the technicality, technical design that you need to put in place for immersive storytelling and actually the creating storytelling. So what I'm trying to do is, as part of my research, but also with my students, is trying to actually fill in that gap in a way, to try to get students to get into a place where they have the technical abilities to express their creativity. That's what I'm looking for.
Yes, I'm just finishing my PhD, so bye by next week. So yeah, crazy couple of weeks. But my PhD was specifically looking at ways in which video games and contemporary performance practice can learn from one another, enhance one another, and how we can create playful experiences at these fringes, at the absolute edges, where the kind of like the borders blend and merge, and where we can experiment with hybrid storytelling, where we can look at ways in which we can bring all these experiences in heritage environments, where we can bring them into site-specific locations, and how we can let spaces talk through technology. So I think those are all areas that I'm really interested in, being playful with these fringes. Yeah.
Simon?
Yes, I'm Simon. I run a video games development company called The Secret Experiment, which is ostensibly something I set up 5 years ago to allow me to explore storytelling within video games. I've got a sort of long-held belief that the potential for storytelling in video games can sort of surpass any other art form, you know, in as much as it can be any other art form and it can also amalgamate them. And I think, you know, certainly what I've been trying to do is create experiences which can sit alongside literature, theatre, independent world cinema, and sort of stand their own in that space. Yeah, so I've created a few games. I also am an associate at ISO Design, where I sort of help with their virtual reality and augmented reality side of things, where they're exploring the sort of immersive experience design, both site-specific, but also how sort of narrative works within sort of the virtual space. And I'm particularly interested in this notion of narrative intrusion at the moment, the idea that actually by putting a player in a space, that should actually have a sort of an impact on the fabric of the world that they're in. It's typical game design seems to be about creating constructs to interact with, but I quite like the idea that as you sort of forcibly push people into a world, that maybe the world has to respond to them more than them responding to the world. So quite good at that at the moment. At the V&A, I spent 6 months pretty much exploring the idea of fragmented narratives and how narratives can exist across different medias and different art forms and combine to create something bigger than the sum of the parts. And particularly the one thing which I'm very slightly obsessed with, partly because I've probably never managed to bring in enough funding to do something which is totally realistic. I'm very much into this idea of abstraction and the idea of we should be making more use of the audience imagination in the creation of storytelling and worlds than what the current trends and technology seem to be pushing us in the direction of. You know, I'm not a huge fan into using technology to recreate things in a pixel perfect scenario. I'm much more like using technology as a way to express emotions and take people into places inside themselves. So yes, that's it.
Beautiful.
I'm Lynn. I'm really interested in play and games, and I explore that in different ways. My PhD was looking at using digital games or creating spaces which use play as a method to bring people together. So I'm really interested in connecting people temporarily through play and what can come from that. So the kind of harnessing the transformative potential of play for the players themselves. So not necessarily a serious game route, but more about actually using play to allow people to try on different roles and to identify problems for themselves and issues for themselves that might enact them to change something about their situation. I'm also really interested in the sort of physical and the digital, so I like to make games that blur those kinds of things. And I haven't ever made a game that just exists on the screen, so I really like using props, and I really like so the game with the poncho one, and I collaborated on that with a couple of people. And so I like these kind of games that challenge people physically. They blur the boundaries between the screen and the real space. I also like to make people feel awkward, because I think that feeling awkward and feeling awkward together and designing around that, using that as a design technique, has a lot of potential for helping us make connections with each other and have memorable kind of play experiences. I'm also kind of interested in temporary nature of the kind of games that we make, because you can't download them and play them at home. They exist in a space temporarily. They're more of an event, and I've sort of taken that into other elements in my practice. So I have this chalk-based sort of project that I'm working on, which just involves me taking play out into the streets with chalk. And it's amazing how many people come up to you and go, "Are you allowed to do that? It's chalk." Of course I'm allowed to chalk on the street. It's great. I'm about play in every day, trying to draw people's attention to play and use that to create kind of temporary pleasant experiences, or awkward but pleasant experiences for people.
Okay, so I think that shows the diversity of voices, but also there's already, I think, some commonality in things that start to emerge in terms of the things you're discussing. I think just to kind of break the ice a little bit, the best thing to do would be to pick up on a little bit of something that Sam alluded to, which was this idea of trends, and what are the trends. So I wondered, collectively, what do you think have been the kind of common trends lately around this idea that the thing that's been called immersive experiences or immersive design is a common piece of jargon just now. It can mean many things, like games can mean many things. But what do you think are the common trends around immersion or immersive experience design currently?
Well, I think, immersive experience design, that's what it's sort of a hardware-driven phenomenon at the moment, and I think this is some time to its. It can be quite a negative thing. I think, we seem to be slightly hung up in the gimmick of immersive design. I think, I think we sort of go, ooh, we can put the helmet on somebody and transport them into a space, and the trend seems to be not looking past the immediate response to what that could be. And I think that's from a storytelling point of view and from a sort of narrative point of view, I feel that's quite limiting, because I think every new medium, actually what it really presents is a whole new way of doing things. And I think that for me, and sorry, this is a positive trend, but the trend seems to be that we're not exploring the new way, we just seem to be adapting in a very, very obvious, let's port something directly into this space. So for me, the trends, although you see the potential in what's there, and certainly I see sort of huge amounts of potential, unfortunately I still sort of feel that it feels quite shallow as a medium. And so that's a real negative for me. The potential's there, but the trend at the moment is still so wrapped up in the immediate sort of hardware that I feel that we're still having to wait for the good stuff to emerge.
Just a bit on that. You see that in games and interactive media all the time. The drawing from cinema to try and make storytelling work in interactive media, rather than being bold and trying new things. There's almost this reliance on looking at other techniques that work and put them over. So I totally agree.
No, you're right, and I think that's funny, because I wrote this note down earlier. It's just like, yes, games have always used Hollywood as a beacon. It seems that what VR does is uses theme parks as a beacon. And now, and again, fine, but that will be to the detriment of the media unless we can sort of push beyond that.
and what elements of the theme park as well, because there are many elements in the theme park that it could be exploring more, like sensory immersion for me is one of these things that first comes to mind. I think smells are underused, and it was really great that we have Emily's project over there. Tactile senses are underused. Yeah, I think we're so focusing on the visual, sometimes even the audio, that all the other senses are completely ignored. And I think that's a shame, because that's what immersive kind of needs for me. I don't know if it's a trend at all, but...
And it's funny, isn't it, because the hardware, almost the first iteration of the hardware seemed to try to want to give you the perfect first-person shooter experience. And as much as, you know, it was the treadmill, the weighted gun, and it was strange. It was like, it exists to make the first-person shooter, you know, this totally immersive experience. And again, I think it's about, you have to sort of lose those shackles, don't you? You have to break free of these sort of constraints before the medium starts to...
But I think what we need to really keep in mind is display, right? It is a lot richer in terms of immersion, in terms of graphics, but it is poor in terms of interaction. Because what you actually get is you get that added immersions, and mentally you made a shift because you're so much more immersed. You expect to actually interact in a much more intuitive way, which you can't. It's actually poorer in terms of what you can do in terms of interaction. So every time you use a controller, you're actually breaking that immersion that's been built as a graphical world in a way. However, on the more positive aspects of things, I do think that HMDs are actually perfect for, I don't like the term, but when people talk about walking sims, for instance, I do think that VR is perfect for this. There are games that are deeply immersive from a narrative perspective, but they don't have a lot of user interface. You know, they don't have a lot of controls. And while this could have been maybe frustrating for some players, like on a PC type version, I think in terms of VR, you've got the opportunity there to actually have something a lot more intuitive as well. Well, that's my view on this. But so I don't say it completely negative, but I agree with Simon. I think in terms of the format of what you provide the player as an experience, I do think that the first-person shooter is not what we should be trying to do. We should be trying to do something different, and actually looking at games maybe as a driving force. Like traditional approach to games might not be the main thing. Maybe we should be looking at performances and performative arts maybe as inspiration.
But it's almost like the trend is about shifting the hardware, and they know that the first wave of consumers are your hardcore gamers. Effectively, people are going to soup up the machines and buy the kits. So it feels, you know, it was the right thing bizarrely to do. But if that was, I think that's reflective of the digital engagement space being very, very commercialized, in as much as, you know, the person with finances is in control of the art. So I think the other thing is actually this is the use of the neck as a controller, which is ultimately, you know, that is the trend. I mean, it's just we've been using thumbs for a while now. We've suddenly got this neck, and there's been this obsession about the neck. Oh, well, what do? You turn your neck. Of course you do. But like, I was just trying to monitor how I walked through the streets of Dundee earlier, and as far as I could tell, I wasn't turning my neck, swiveling in every single direction at every opportunity, looking, you know, like desperately. So I was like, oh, the use of my neck in material world is very different than the use of my neck supposed in immaterial world. And then the only other, my only trend, which I always go on about, so I just want to mention it, is like, the trend of, and it's quite interesting actually, because VR actually does dislocate this in a really nice way, but the trend of the director's vision is key. Like, basically, the trend of the last decade for me has been about, and particularly as the computer technology has allowed us to go into, you know, reality and actually totally take the director's vision and give it us. I sort of feel like the audience as an imaginative element in the end experience has been diminishing. I think very much the notion of play or interaction is very much like, come and enter my world, and this is my world. And I think you see that in the way that Hollywood projects its films. I think there has been this trend that the director's vision is key. So that's why I quite like abstraction, because it brings the player back in. But what's really interesting in VR is actually the director's role changes, because you're not just given a single viewport. The director's vision has to be something which is sort of tackled slightly differently. So I think there's a trend that's really interesting. I think that will bring about amazing new forms of storytelling.
For narrative design, you've got to give ways. You need to let the player take ownership of some of this, because you can't control it as precisely as you would do in film or TV or even in traditional games, because that control is not there. So you probably need to explain different ways of it. That's very exciting.
Maybe that's the difference as well, because I've been thinking a lot about the difference between creative writing and narrative design, right? So there's a big difference there. Creative writing still has that kind of like very strong authorial voice, the director's view, as you were saying, but narrative design feels almost like narrative plotting and just kind of creating this narrative playground where players can, audience players,
I'm really disappointed that immersion means VR in this discussion, in terms of trends. And I'm not disappointed in others, I'm disappointed in the fact that that is the main commercial option people have, to engage in this, what we call immersive play. And there were some movements towards things that were trying to blur the boundary between the sort of physical and the digital. So I'm thinking Disney Infinity, which is kind of interesting. Not that I'm saying it's immersive, but it's doing something kind of interesting. And Beasts of Balance does something really kind of quite fun. It's not necessarily immersive, but it's definitely doing something more interesting commercially in the space than VR. So I can't think of any other trends though, other the things that we're doing that are more accessible temporarily are immersive, but there's not a commercial version of that, unless we go into the app space.
Atmosphere.
Oh,
Atmosphere. Give me an example there. Atmosphere was great. Atmosphere had you pulling your blinds and putting some candles around you and then playing. It was great. It's brilliant. That's how we should be focusing on.
But I guess the app space is probably where you see a little bit more of this kind of stuff. So location-based things are probably doing something that's at least in the real world, rather than sitting in a different room with a helmet on. I'm really scared by the potential of us all sort of getting locked into these helmets. Maybe because when my husband's got it on, I'm sort of, hi, hello. I feel like a VR widow. So yeah, I don't know where I'm going with this point.
Hashtag VR widow. Please, hashtag VR widow.
I think it does give us a good departure. What Lynn said there about if I ask a group of people that are broadly interested in experimental ideas around play, storytelling, what is the trend, and even we lent towards VR as identifying that as the issue. And also something Simon said about this focus on the hardware and trying to satisfy that. The hardware as an opportunity rather than being creative. So I think in relation to what we're talking about today in immaterial worlds, what do you think about the current state of immersive? Is that limiting our creativity with linking material and immaterial worlds? Because something like virtual reality is almost purpose-built to eliminate the material altogether. It's almost like the end game of this is a completely immaterial virtual space. I don't know if that's a statement or a provocation or a question.
I do like the idea of this next generation of headsets actually being more aware of the environment around you in a sense. Because actually there is, digital does lack tactile, and tactile is a lovely, lovely thing. So it's a whole sense, so smell, sound, all that sort of stuff. But there is something nice about transforming the reality. So you do have a lot of site-specific VR type stuff. If we also talk about VR, but I totally agree. Actually, immersion as a broader topic shouldn't just be limited to VR at all. In fact, what's lovely is we do actually have a brilliant theatrical heritage in immersive stuff like Wenstrom we do way before that anyway. So yeah, I think.
Do you think VR is more convenient? You can sit in your room and stick on a helmet, and you don't have to go out into the broadly. So although it's expensive, it's got this convenience, which some of these other experiences don't.
No, it does. I mean, it has the potential to open up the mass market, but at the moment, unlike the VHS and everybody had a VHS, so the atmosphere was a no-brainer, and also, you know, the atmosphere was effectively bringing the family together around a bit of technology which was universal. I mean, VR, there's not that many experiences which bring the family together or friends together. There are some.
But that's a very interesting point. That's something. So if you think about VR, when you put on the VR headset, you are going into another world, right? But you are effectively cutting yourself from the world, right? And we haven't talked about augmented reality, but augmented reality to me is the opposite. With augmented reality, you're still experimenting some level of like immersive digital aspects, but you're actually not shutting off the world. You can actually participate. You know, we could be 5, 6 people there experiencing augmented reality at the same time from different angles, and maybe from a narrative perspective, seeing different aspects of the story or seeing different things, and use that as a way to actually communicate and develop a common understanding. So I think we often talk about VR, the head-mounted display, but I don't think we talk enough about the actual potential of augmented reality, especially if you're starting to talk about like museum exhibitions or like curated type of work. There you are sharing that space that is physical, but you're also sharing that space that is digital, and you can actually work together. So I think that's kind of like, that's maybe a different angle to this.
That's actually different terms. It's like augmented reality and augmented virtuality. If you can believe that on the mixed reality continuum, but I think it's kind of crossing into mixed reality territory. But I think, I don't know, I mean, for me, immersive was never VR. When I saw my lectureship position advertised, when I read immersive experience design, I didn't think of VR for even 1 second. I'm not technical, I don't have any technical abilities. My abilities are from the theater, kind of creating immersive experiences, literally, not technologically enabled. So I think for me it came more from a punch-drunk line than VR line.
Are we talking about different kinds of immersion? So, VR is the traditional kinds of immersion we step into this world, and we're disconnected from anyone who's not inside that digital world. Because VR can be social, we can acknowledge that. But with these augmented reality you're talking about, what's kind of interesting there is we're not just immersed into play, we're using that as a sort of social object. We are around the play together, there are 5 or 6 of us, and we're actually communicating with one another, and it's more like a card game or a board game. So it's neither just about the game nor the social interaction, it's the two fused together, which is, I guess, a different kind of immersion, and maybe immersion in a more traditional sense when it comes to play, at least. I'm not going to touch the theatre element.
No, that's true. I think because like storytelling in any form is immersion. Whether you're reading a book or whether you're collectively around a board game, which I would argue is storytelling as well. You generate the stories. The only time it's not immersion is when it's done badly and you're aware that you're doing that thing. So a bad book or a bad written book is something where you're aware of reading the words. A bit of poor cinema is where you're aware of something in the theatre watching the screen. Bad video game stories when you're just aware that you're just going through the motions of the mechanics and stuff like that. Bad VR is when you're just hyper aware that you're wearing the headset, which is most times at the moment, I would say. After that initial, ooh, wow, this is cool, and then you're suddenly like, actually, why am I in here? And then you suddenly, it's probably at that point where you're hyper aware that you're standing, particularly if it's site specific, you're standing there and other people are watching you. That's the that sort of kick out way where it's not working.
And kind of bringing it into site-specific, I think is really interesting because my peers and Lux, for example, they call site-specific performance, like the work you bring to a site, they call it a ghost, and you bring it to a host, and it's always the interplay between ghost and host. So the work you're bringing still needs to be transparent enough to actually augment the space you're going to, so they kind of need to enhance each other. So it needs to be kind of visible in a way as well. Translucent, almost like a ghost.
So I think we are focusing quite a lot on the technology. I don't know if that is because, is this an issue with the consumerism around these technologies that we focus on this? So for instance, VR, like Simon said, VR is a very easy thing to point to and say, this is the future, I guess. So it's been the future in the past as well, and now it's the future again. If you speak to a lot of people working in creative industries, you might actually say, well, there's not much scope in VR, there's more scope in AI, machine learning, 5G opens up more things than necessarily a VR headset. So are we a little bit locked into talking about these things because these are the products that we would be expected to sell or make games for, make experiences for? I mean, the other thing that strikes me is that coming from from a game design context, this is a current trend, obviously, immersive experiences. More doesn't think it means VR. Other people think it means something else. It means augmented reality, it means theatre, it means just storytelling and suspension of disbelief. It means so many different things. And yet, from a games background, we've always had gadgets. So there was laser guns for screens. And if we didn't call that immersive technique, it was no less immersive than a VR headset. So again, I think I'm asking a question, we can go on for a rant, as I like to do. I thought it was curious if we talk about technology kind of those ways. One thing I wanted to kind of move to beyond the technology was this notion of the audience. Like the word game meaning many different things, I think audience means very many different things. So from a games or a playful media, a playful interaction perspective, how would you collectively define who this audience is? Are they a player? Are they a user? Are they a spectator? A reader?
It's because I call them audience players. So I think that actually in my PhD I say why I keep referring to participants as audience players, and it's because they constantly are needed in the types of experience that I design. They're constantly needed to kind of shift between these modes of engagement. And I think that's where the kind of like the critical stance becomes brought to the fore a little bit. Is where you're asking people to engage with audio, and then to engage with the game, and then to engage with the film, and then kind of like take all this in and try to piece all these bits together and create an overarching narrative out of all these like disparate forms. I think you need a term that's a bit more encompassing, maybe even with that slash in between.
I mean, I'm a big fan. I think the content defines the audience, though, doesn't it? Traditionally, I would also say the medium defines the audience, but actually with VR, when you say VR to some people talk about 360 filmmaking, which is a very passive thing, really. There's sort of a periscope version of VR where it can actually be fully interactive in game design. So I actually think the audience within an immersive space is quite an analogous entity. I don't think they're necessarily fully defined, because I always feel like, all audiences are created equal. When you put them, book in front of them, they become a reader. You put a screen, and they're a viewer. Generally, put a game in front of them, they become a player. And then but then if you're a player, the question is, so what part does this audience have to play? And ultimately, if the part they have to play is, that's at the nub of it, isn't it? So okay, so effectively, the audience in a game, the first thing they do is they go, what do you want me to do? Ultimately, that's what a game is. It's sort of, okay, I'm here to do something. What do you want us to do? And I think that is interesting. So that's the audience as a very active participant, as opposed to a film or something. What do you want me to do? Well, I just want to sit back, relax, and enjoy the ride, sort of thing. So I do sort of feel, but interestingly, within VR space, at the point that you put the helmet on, I'm not actually. You're not always aware what level of interaction you're going to have, whether you do have a task or whether you're just going to sit back and crane your neck to watch things play out. So it's quite interesting. It's like an ill-defined, whereas other medium can have a very clear notion of who their audience is. Maybe VR and immersive slightly suffers from that because the audience can sort of be anywhere on that sliding scale.
I'm really interested in the spaces where audiences can change modes between. So I think you're talking about different modes that you might deliver in an immersive experience, but quite a lot of what I do is play in public settings or play in places where people don't even know that they're playing. So I really like the idea of dark play and how people get drawn into play without even realising. and then how they shift between, being outside, I'm going to say it, Project Circle, being outside that and then getting invited in, and also being around the edge of that. So I don't know that it matters so much whether you're a spectator or a player, but how actually do we help people to transition through these different kinds of experiences to help enhance their immersion. And I think in a public play space, like where we show a lot of our kind of installation games, we're designing to draw people over, we're designing to capture their attention in a busy space, we're designing to then say to them, come have a shot. We've developed design techniques to help do that, to draw attention to ourselves, to let people learn by watching, to develop a community around a game that then encourages people to sort of say, well, here's how you play it, and pass it on to each other. And so I think actually for immersion it's really interesting, enabling people to move through these different modes and to have the level of participation that they're comfortable with. Because I think the thing, I know we're talking about VR a lot, but I think VR is quite exclusive. Like there's an age range and an audience that it definitely appeals to. But I don't think that games necessarily need to be pigeonholed in this sort of thing. I think it can have very broad appeal. So how do we make it as accessible as possible? How do we invite people through these experiences? So that's kind of what I'm really interested in. And everyone will be a player at some point, but how much they play should be up to them and their comfort levels.
I do think that conceptually there's still a link to the technology you're using. If you're going to use technology for immersive storytelling or immersive, kind of like immersive environment in a way, because different technologies, different displays are going to provide the audience, spectators, with different opportunities to express themselves. And maybe the line is not so much onto whether the audience is participating or co-creating, or maybe it's on the spectrum of, let's say, narrative creativity, which different technologies have a different, amount of different opportunities. So it's the same thing with games, right? You've got a huge amount of narrative, creativity, potential playing Dungeons and Dragons, where you don't need a VR headset to play Dungeons and Dragons. You'll be able to play some games that are like, Skyrim or something. Maybe common in terms of theme, you're still going to have some level of creativity and expression to those things, but it's not going to be as much as it is in the board game, for instance. And I think it's probably the same thing with when we talk about immersive design, immersive systems. It's whichever technology you're going to use or whichever support you're going to use, you're going to have a spectrum of opportunities and interactions. And I think that's maybe, as far as that's maybe that's a way to look into it, because you can have a range of, you can play a range of roles with any technology. So how do you exploit it as best as you can?
Yeah, I think that really links with how I make things. So when I make things, I start with the technology because it's better to have some sort of constraint. And as you say, different technologies afford different kinds of interactions and invite different kinds of solutions. So yeah.
That's really interesting because that's exactly how I make things.
Yeah,
I will always start with an idea, and I think it was possibly because when I was a journalist in television development, my head of development always used to say to me, "It's a great idea. Why is it a TV show?" And it was always like, ideas. You have ideas, but the expression of the ideas is an interesting process as well. So it's quite good. So it is quite. I think that's possibly why my career sent me in bizarre directions, which is probably not necessarily good for my the tagline or whatever when it puts me epitaph on my grave or something like that. But because I often, if you get an idea, I'm sort of slightly obsessed by going, that idea should express itself in the best way, whether that is a bit of theatre, whether it is a bit of sort of computer game, or whether it's even a piece of music, or so I suppose that excites me. But then that's really interesting though, because actually I think the opportunity is the fact that people you're coming from one side, I'm from the other side, so it's a collaboration effort that's really interesting, because you might be able to take the things I'm saying and go, actually, well, this is what I'm thinking on that as well, and I think that's really cool.
Yeah, I think the best kind of collaborations work when you bring people together to think about things differently. And the best results I have is when I work with Mona, because you come in things totally non-technically. That's why you have culture, and it's one of the most successful things for the game. But I think the best collaborations you get these people that think different ways and try to start idea first too. And then we just get lost in a vortex. So always bring it back to technology, unfortunately. So that's probably skewing your conversation a little bit.
And I think technical limitations are good though as well, because if you have those and then you have a theme, I mean, we used phones for both my PhD projects in very different ways, but it was always like almost creating these hubs around which people kind of centered, and they were sharing, so they were sharing the phone but also sharing stories. So it kind of like depends how you integrate it within a larger concept. So if you're wanting to explore a theme like intergenerational exchange or community or these kind of things, then technology is really great if you kind of like strategically place it and give people, here's a splitter and 5 headphones, you 5, go. I think sometimes you can get.
No, I think you're right. I think actually there's some things nice and so what I said before is probably right, like it's something that is actually quite neat to go, I want to make something in this context, within this world. And then, but then what you would do is maybe your idea is you have one, but if you don't try and shoot on the wrong idea into that world, you just park it and think, okay, maybe that's something I'll come back with a later date. But yeah, it's cool.
Do you ever get to go back? Sorry.
Do you ever go back
to these things?
to the ideas?
Yeah.
Definitely. Oh no, I think that's good. I think it's nice when you've left something long enough that you can't actually remember the genesis of the idea. Something just being handed a gift. Because like, providing something good.
I'd like to take some things that have been said and bring it back to the kind of material. And the immaterial is what we're really interested in, because I think we've already alluded to this a little bit. Lynn mentioned things like Disney Infinity, which was kind of commercial failure, really, in Disney's terms. So it didn't make every billion, therefore it was a failure. But these things captured the imagination of people. So I wanted to think about where is the scope for the material objects and the immaterial objects and the virtual objects and the physical objects. How do we design these things for new forms of play? And I wondered a little bit whether we're being constrained by this idea of there being cookie cutters. So what is a mobile game? There was cookie cutters and then everyone made those games. What is a VR experience? What's a first-person shooter? Therefore we make first-person shooters. And I was wondering what you thought about whether that is problematic, and that actually what we have is a range of tools and technologies, and really, as Sam was alluding to, we have an idea, or we have a story we want to tell. And are we maybe missing the opportunities to kind of do that because there's this idea of cookie cutters? So anyway, the question was mostly, and I've gone off on a tangent again, mostly about how do we keep that focus on the linking of the physical and the digital, and what are the opportunities to do really interesting with that? Yeah.
I suppose that, in terms of, I suppose earlier I was thinking as well, it's like, I don't know, maybe this is around about where you've answered the question, but like, when we talk about immersive experience and tying to one technology, it's not like that should be the entire expression of an idea. So one of the things I absolutely loved when I was growing up with computer games was feelies, and the idea, so you go and buy a game, and it would come in a massive oversized box, and then you'd have your bus journey home, and on that bus journey home you'd open the box and you'd get out the stuff. Now that was material. So my onboarding, because I think onboarding is quite an interesting sort of concept generally with digital, site specific and all that, like what do you do to get to the digital experience? And obviously particularly with Spectrum games and stuff, even when you got home the digital experience was still 15 minutes of wailing sound, digital noise and horrible sort of visuals. But actually there was something lovely about that, the idea that things can exist separately, but as part of the same space. So I suppose my interest, I suppose what you were saying before, like how do they work together? I think there is something lovely about the VR sort of world, and then you touching it and feeling it, or being able to take something which is physical and present it into the digital space. But actually, I think what's even more interesting is thinking stories and concepts and ideas can be built out of multiple media components. Like proper mixed media. I mean, the word multimedia is frowned upon because it's too associated with CD-ROM sort of era stuff, so people just assume it's old school. But I quite like the term multimedia, so you can't use it. I think mixed media, because it sort of indicates that you're drawing on different forms of media, whether they are material or immaterial. So I suppose what I don't like, if I'm being brutally honest, is I'd much prefer to go and see an artifact than a digital rendering of that artifact. To me, it's a no-brainer. You know, if there's something to see and touch, I want to go and see it and touch it. And I don't think the digital can ever support that. But so let's not try and replicate what doesn't need replicated. Let's work together and think, how does the digital move it off into some different place? Like one of the things I'd absolutely love to do is work with an installation artist on a digital space. Somebody who's used to sort of transformative of actual physical space to tell a story or to present an emotion or a slice through time. You know, somebody who sees space as an art form and actually use them in a digital space. Okay, they lose tactile, but they also are liberated in terms of space and in some respect budget and audience. And that's very interesting. And actually, you know, when I look at storytelling in games, I often feel that it's let down by their environments. I feel that the environments are passing places rather than places which often reflect the world or the living aspect of it. And I'm really bad because if I ever play a game where I'm given a space to explore, I do spend a lot of time looking and go, that desk just, it's like, okay, somebody works here. I just think that's not how people leave their day. You know, like the whole, as soon as I start to overthink it, it throws me out. Total tangents, but yes, I suppose ultimately that immaterial material thing, I think, let them work together, but they don't necessarily have to overlap. They can exist in their own spaces, and you could pull them together with something bigger.
I think it also, it kind of, just as you're talking about it, it leads to a shift, doesn't it, in the way that we think about the products that we're engaging with. So, because I love that, you know, when you have the box and like, that's gone unfortunately, but to have this material and immaterial kind of experience and have it meaningful, we have to start to think about games not necessarily, including video games, not necessarily as something that, you know, we download and we play at home, although, you know, we have to start to think about games and play as events. You know, so you go out, like you would go to see a theatrical performance, you go out to play a game which has material, multimedia elements that we're using to making it. So if you've made it okay. You know, because that's, it starts to become, I'm sort of thinking about, you buy a £20 game or a £3 game on your phone, you can have an experience, and for some people that's affordable, but then to have these experiences that really fuse the material and the immaterial, and make use of performance and these kind of elements, leaning into maybe some, I don't know how much a plastic experience or something like that, it starts to become more expensive. And then people sort of think, well, I could pay £50 for a game that gives me 50 hours to play, or I can spend £25 and go to this game event that's 2 hours, and they start to put up the cost. So it maybe needs a little bit of a shift about cost benefit. And I'm sort of wandering around my point here, I don't know if it's coming across. Because the thing that Disney Infinity did is it played this immateriality, and they did it in an affordable way where you could play at home. But it didn't work.
Oh, but Skylanders did.
Skylanders did,
yeah.
I forgot about Skylanders, thank you.
Well, in the end it did fail. But I mean, like, you know, but it just ran its course. But I mean, you know,
I guess there's a thing with, you know, they're in a very similar market, and there's a point where parents don't want to buy extra peripherals and they don't want to keep buying all the bits, and you know, commercial games being the way that they are, they always bring out new versions, and it's just a money pit, isn't it? So I think we've got an exciting opportunity in this sort of experimental element to kind of explore it without the commercial constraints of being judged at Disney or.
Yeah, but then again, look how expensive it is to go to Disney World. You know, I think it's.
I don't mean to make it about money, but I think that I'm sorry talking about the mindset of the people. So you think about games, and a game costs this much, and they get this, you know, this is what I get for that investment. And whereas if I go to Disneyland, I get memories of a lifetime, and you know, so people weigh that up differently, don't they? And why is that? And how do we change that culture?
Well, how do we make them memories of a lifetime then? How do we make these events memories of a lifetime?
That
I
is
think
the
that's the
question,
challenge.
yeah.
people do also love material, don't they? Like, so I released Beckett last year, and I also co-released a record, and the record's for sale in the V&A, and that's already in second press, and so people like this idea of there's a value in material which doesn't exist in digital. But that was interesting, because what I did with theirs, even though Beckett existed in the game, and the V&A asked, well, they wanted to commission a physical version of it, so I sort of took back and go, well, what might that look like? So I created a pack of like 55 story cards, which are effectively fragments from the original idea. So there's some stuff which made the game, some stuff which didn't. But actually that physicalization, now to me, that in itself is quite a nice product, but it works really nicely if you sit alongside the game as well as the rep. And I like the idea that something can exist in digital and physical, because why not in a way? And the thing I did at the V&A, which was all about, that was fragmented storytelling, and it was effectively a series of character events or vignettes in a fictional town in the east of Scotland. But the eventual output I decided to print on a newspaper, as a tabloid newspaper format, because I thought it was representative of that space. You know, the Courier and all these local papers were quite important. And actually that was quite interesting, because you could have done that digitally, but you would have lost what made that right. And I think that's probably what I'm thinking of about this sort of how does material and immaterial work, is like, you need to make those same choices based on the content. Like, what of this is the physical, and why is it physical? Which bits are digital and why? And I think it's that question which you've always got to ask, isn't it? It's just like, yeah, just the why. I mean, we talk about things we want to do, but like, it's lovely to sort of go, why? Who wants this? You know, what's the intention and stuff like that. So.
And one thing we haven't talked about in this question is this complementarity between the two as such. So do we really understand how the physical can complement the digital and vice versa? So, I mean, I started Beckett, for instance. Right? I played Beckett as a digital experience, and to me it is a digital experience. However, if I get the cards, I would be playing with the cards, but at the same time, I will also be revisiting my digital experience. And that's something that is valuable as an experience, that is worth exploring, but this is not something that we see very much on the game, commercial, entertainment kind of area. You don't see that type of thing very much. You'll see people and companies play on the nostalgia aspects of things. But that's not complementary. That's just making money, right? But there is a link there between people's relationships with their past experiences and you know, and maybe some physical element. So can we think about a way of augmenting the past experiences through physical artifacts, or the other way around, in such a way that you tapped into an element of psychology that is beyond, you know, just like how we used to play Street Fighter and you could like Street Fighter, you could do the thing, right? And I think there is a very interesting space there that I don't really see being exploited that much, or explored as much as we should be. I mean, when you think in terms of, especially if you think in terms of like museums and the type of experience you're trying to get there in those places, or places where you go on location, and there is something there that can be explored.
I mean, I think it's really interesting. I keep talking about my own projects, which makes me feel really silly. But when we did Inchone project, was a project on an island where we recreated. We did a live adaptation of the Arrestor, which is a walking simulator set on an island. And the island was very evocative of the island in the Arrestor. So I'm wondering, because what I was exploring was, can you create a fictional world that's strong enough to support both the live experience and the game experience? And can you create points between them of this kind of communication where they almost seem to be the same experience? And it was really interesting because I think it was you and Danny who were talking about, like, how did you make those rocks?
Well, yeah, because it reframed the whole of the world. So all of a sudden we started to look at the island as a set, and I was like, the rendering of that's back to the rendering the rendering of those rocks, they made out of foam, like they're really convincing. You know, we're on a real island with real rocks, but all of a sudden it's a set, you know, and it's a mental shift.
So when you create all those points of connection between the two, I'm wondering if you can achieve these bleedings, you know, these slippages of meaning and this kind of like material objects and different.
I was chatting to Felix, I can't remember if this is one of his projects or not, so I can't attribute it to Punch Drunk, or might be Punch Drunk Holidays, which was an idea. But one of the core things they had was you got a letter and it said, at some point over the next 48 hours, you're going to be contacted by such and such. And the idea that somebody was just going to come up to you and tap you on the shoulder, but it says the process of somebody saying that made you reframe reality. Because suddenly everybody was the potential of this actor. And that's sort of quite nice, isn't it? Because then you're impacting the material world just with an idea and a notion. And I think there's something, if you could somehow blend that with the digital, that would be really cool. So.
I think this kind of brings us to what Lynn was talking about, you know, that it's not necessarily LARP, but maybe alternate reality games, you know, like the masquerade ones, where you didn't know who in New York is a vampire, and you had to have the little secrets, so you're like on the lookout, because anybody can be. And I think that world of possibility is just like really great when you get that magic circle and you just explode it all over.
And there's a lovely thing you can do, isn't it? Like you can take the reality that you know and just overlay a fiction and swap everything else. You know, the basic audio to it, like just no matter where you are in the world, you can see the building closest to you used to be where XXX lived, and in this house this happened. And suddenly you've reframed reality in a slightly different way, and that's total immersion, as long as the content and storytelling is good enough.
I was told a story by Sandy from Poor Boy Theatre Productions, and she was running a production in Glasgow, and there just so happened to be a rowdy police centred event happening nearby where the walk through the city was happening, and at the end everyone started saying, oh, it's amazing you got the police involved and all this, and it was just happenstance, but it just that all of a sudden, because if you're invented into this narrative world and you're convinced about it, you look at everything and reframe. You've got these rules and specs, I guess, that reframe everything, and then you start to fill in the gaps, and you build more of a narrative world than is necessarily there by looking at what's around you. Yeah,
you bring everything in it and make it fit somehow, even if it wasn't intended to be there. Because we have people walk on the other side of the island and they found some weird notes that we didn't leave, but then they incorporated all of that into the narrative. So it's like, this is amazing.
Yeah, we're just predisposed to connecting dots, aren't we, all the time? So you throw a bunch of things and we'll make something out of it, and then it makes it unique to you, because the next time I thought, police wasn't there. That's lovely, isn't it?
And then I think that's where really interesting things happen, is when I know that Last Theory, sometimes when they do productions, they have a debrief afterwards and they give people an opportunity to talk about their experiences, and I think that's where meaning really comes, and the idea of getting a memorable lifetime experience is actually making sense of what you've been through, comparing with other people. I mean, I've seen interactive pieces of film, but I've only seen one version of that film, and until I speak to people who've had different experiences, just like if you play through Red Dead Redemption or something, like you talk to someone else and they say, oh, I came across this thing, or I came across that thing, and all of a sudden you're like, oh, that makes my experience unique, this is something that I own, and you know, it frames it for you as well. So there's something about this kind of debrief which we don't have necessarily in immersive experiences, that help, I guess, to enhance the value for me anyway.
That's interesting. I've got a couple of points there on what you just said. So I think the first one is what Simon was saying initially, was we need to remember that narratives, it's a communication device. The whole point of narrative is sense making, right? You see a set of stimuli and you interpret the stimuli and you build, a sequence of things, and then that's how you interpret the world. We use it all the time. So coming to games, it makes a lot of sense to have, especially when you're talking about VR, for instance, very poor, tangible kind of like interaction. It makes a lot of sense to actually design a story world that the player discover and interpret, and you can discover certain things and other things and not certain things, and then you make your own interpretation, which I think is great. It's a great way to do it. Going back to like the Red Dead, and you've got different stories. So initially my background was more into artificial intelligence. And really what you do is, it's a bit cheating in a way, right? Okay, so it's not really intelligent. It's just following rules. It's just following rules very well in a way that makes you believe that it is intelligent. To me, it's the same thing as interactive storytelling. You can create an environment, an immersive storytelling environment. That is essentially the same for everybody who plays it, as long as they believe that other people are having different experiences, or their path or their choices are meaningful. Everybody can play the exact same story, the exact same thing, the exact same sequence. As long as they don't replay it, they'll never know.
You can make all sorts of claims about things being unique, and it's not until you have that opportunity to discuss and say you can sort of highlight something that's if it's there, it doesn't mean you own this unique to your play experience.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And I think that was the thing that I heard about Red Dead, is that when my other half played it, he heard all these people saying about new things that happened to them, and they all happened to him. And then he was like, oh no, I've not had a unique experience at all. So you got the
Okay, I think we've covered quite a few things that are of interest. I mean, one of the things that stands out for me, we started to go back quite a bit, we started a discussion there about commodification of memory, really. So the constraints that happen within game design generally, that it's really difficult to be successful with these kind of immaterial fusions, because there's this need, like Lynn pointed out. The consumer market today expects a game to cost X, and X is increasingly less than what it used to be in the past, despite the fact that the cost of game development is not exponential. So there's this kind of crunch, which makes things like Disney Infinity actually quite hard to achieve commercially. So there's that element, but actually the flip side, what we often overlook, is that we're designing for physical spaces, so sites, or we're trying to make connections between physical spaces and digital spaces. So I wondered within that, just to kind of get close into wrapping up actually, what do you think the opportunities are for people who are coming from a game design background to take their knowledge of how you frame and invite play to digital physical spaces? What are the opportunities for doing that? Reaching out, working with the heritage sector, working with researchers in other fields, what can game designers bring to that space?
Invitations. I'm really good at that. I'm obsessed with those invitations to getting people to play. That first bit, participation, I guess. Especially if you're working in spaces that aren't traditionally seen as participative. So people come along to institutions, certain types of institutions, with a preconceived idea of how they're meant to behave and what's expected in that environment. So, and I think, you know, as game designers, we're always, I think you touched on this already, Sam, because we're always sort of working out how to get people to come into our world, and they're all, you know, in games, you come preconceived with what they're doing. So how do we, you know, we can bring ways of designing invitations that are fit for purpose in different spaces, and that people are working across. And then I think this then moves into what you were talking about, Mona, in terms of like enlivening a space appropriately with a kind of narrative, and then invite people to move through different modes of interaction inside that space, to uncover meaning or new experiences and new kind of connections to the space that they're in, using interactivity as a starting point, but then sensitively integrating it into the site itself. So I was thinking very much about museums and galleries and things, or a city centre.
So like in the same kind of like type of area, that I think it's important to go back to the question of audiences. You know, we explored it a bit before. Is if you're going to have immersive play in a public space, you got two audiences. You got the player, that's going to be the audience for the game. So the game needs to be engaging, needs to be immersive, but you also got your non-playing audience. They become a spectator, or they can be participative in different ways. So I'm wondering sometimes what we should be looking there is looking at our player as the performative element of spectacle for our non-players. playing audience. And then we might be in the domain of esports or even sports in general, that kind of where you observe people facing a challenge, and that becomes entertaining in itself. And wrestling. but you see what I mean? I'm saying that we've got two different audiences there, and I think if you design an immersive experience in a public space, it's really important to think about how you're going to broadcast it to the non-playing people around, right? So I'm going back to my head-mounted display. If you've got something in a public space and someone is having a head-mounted display, unless what that person sees is broadcast to the rest of the audience, no one's going near your program, and it's not interesting. So, how do you actually conceptualize? From a game design perspective, it's very interesting because you're working with two audiences there and then trying to close things together.
And I think we're seeing more asymmetric design, and we're seeing more games coming out commercially that are thinking about that, that players have different views on the world, and they're as interesting to spectate as they are to play. So it's something that's definitely being developed. But yeah, I really love this where you have players push up against people who aren't playing. I think that's really interesting, and especially if you take something like that and you set it in a gallery or a museum, you have to be respectful to those people that aren't playing, but then you also want to make it accessible if they want to join. And I think that presents some really interesting design questions.
And then you can even look at the ways of impacting the audience as well. I mean, one of it's a little bit superficial, but one of the examples was when you go to a Tuesday league game, baseball game in the US, very often you get something like row G. If you score, like a home run in the fifth, everybody gets a free hot dog, right? You invested. There's a different kind of aspect, but we can do that with gameplay and game design in a much more meaningful way and in a much more interactive way. So you could actually, by being a spectator, still be involved, with the actual performers, because that might just affect your own way of living the experience.
Yeah, and I think we have to design experiences that have those different ways of participating. For people that are comfortable to watch, just as much as people who want to play. So that everybody can take something away from it.
In some way, it's the same way we don't all like the same movies, we don't all like the same games, it would be the same thing. If you're designing a public space, you're going to have a wide range of type of players, type of interest, and you need to find a way to actually put those things together if you can. Or offer the opportunities to be part of it, or offer the opportunity not to be part of it, but still benefit from the experience.
And I think that's what we can contribute genuinely as designers, is this kind of a constant trying to understand what the connection is between a story and the interaction, and how we can kind of bring those two together. And two is this constant iteration, is this constant trying to problem solve, constant trying to see how people are interacting with things and adapt and change and learn. And I think that's where our contribution really is, because telling a story in a museum, everybody can do it, but launching that invitation to interact with it in unique ways that kind of benefit the story as well as the interaction, and not just interaction for interaction's sake or story for story's sake, but kind of a bit of both.
Also making that experience more meaningful for the player, the person who's giving them some sort of ownership or co-creation, because I think that's what makes the memories, isn't it? If you feel like you've got some sort of agency.
I also think we all think about audiences in slightly different ways, and I think that's probably the main thing for me. Like, if you bring a film director into a games company, what they're really bringing is a different mindset of their own audience as well, which is what makes it quite fresh. I think you take a video game designer into a cultural space, you think about the audiences in different ways and about their purpose for being there. And actually, I do feel like anything we can do to subvert things is to the benefit. So like, you know, in the same way that audiences know why they're there. So you go to a museum and you're there for a particular, I'm a museum, I'm a visitor in a museum, and actually if you can subvert that experience, it makes something massively meaningful in the same way as we were talking about theatre earlier, and you can change the context around you. I do think this idea of like, let's just be a little bit more anarchic, and I think that's potentially what happens when you mix different disciplines up. You know, it creates something new, but what's new is actually subverting the preconceptions that the audience has, and that's what makes it, for me, really interesting. And of course, you know, put non-player characters in museums would be great.
Just putting museums outside of museums would be even greater. Just like theater started flourishing when you took it outside of the theater. Same with museums, maybe. Oh God, what have I done? But yeah, probably because we have this material and immaterial, because we have technology that allows us to do so. Why not?
So I think we've actually covered quite a lot of points. I'm conscious of time and also the fact that there might be more discussion within the group. So at this point, I'd like to see if there's anybody who have any suggestions for topics of discussion or any questions you want to ask the panel.
Someone else conversation. I'd say you sort of discussed the problem, you raised the fact that maybe the fact that we're at this sort of like total moment of revolution and transformation might actually be a bit of a red herring. Perhaps this is about capitalism and trying to sell new technology, and perhaps, say for the sake of argument, that is the case. How much is there an argument at the moment with these kinds of, with the emergence of these kinds of technologies? How much is there an argument for doing things in completely different ways? And to what extent can we draw upon extant forms of media, extant forms of practice, and sort of continue to work in those modes and develop and advance those modes? Like, so, I suppose, to summarise, because I'm rambling, do you think are we at the point of total transformation, a moment of utter change where everything is unfamiliar and new? Or is this a time for continuity, just to revisit perhaps how we do things slightly?
Yeah, I mean, like, the reason, I mean, ultimately, the digital space is a commercial space. And you know, I try to live my entire life based on how can I find ways for me to experiment within the digital space. But it's an incredibly difficult thing to try and raise funding for you to do something which is perceived as art or culturally significant in the digital space, because the entire digital space is perceived by the art world as a creative economy, you know. So, and equally by the people who are going to put money in put their hands in the pocket and pay for you to make this thing. I mean, they de-risk it. They go, okay, so which audience is this for and stuff. So it is quite difficult, you know, because I think we all agree that the potential is absolutely incredible. And don't get me wrong, you know, like, you know, although VR might have been, you know, might be spearheaded by the hardware and stuff like that. I look at VR and go, oh, that'd be amazing. I'd love it if somebody gave me time and resources to properly do something in that space. But no one is, you know, and like, you know, and you see the greatest experiences coming out, and I can sort of follow the breadcrumb trail back as to why they got the funding. And I think part of the problem is, for me generally, is always my sort of bugbear. Digital media as a whole is slightly dug its own grave because it's the most successful creative industry now. It brings in loads of money, you know, and I think it's because of that, because we're not a struggling art form, which a lot of people are actually, but we're not perceived as a struggling art form. It's quite hard to get grant money to support the progression of it as an art form, if that makes sense. So like, and I think because of that, we sort of get locked into these genres which we know will be commercially successful. And the only time we get to dabble out with, and actually that's why it's quite nice when the other industries like theatre or cultural institutions are going, oh, let's move into digital, because they do have access to things which are perceived as sort of, you know, the grant funding pools. So you might get a bit of money. Unfortunately, probably the money which you're aiming for isn't quite at the scale that these games companies are pumping in. So there's just a bit of an imbalance. And also, particularly when we do look at the audience, I do think the big shift is going to be the sort of democratization or the commoditization of interactive media via streaming platforms such as Netflix, Amazon, Apple, that everything will change there. Because we've seen it with Bandersnatch. You take something which is effectively a 1991 CD-ROM sort of project, but suddenly you're like, wow, this is brilliant. And actually you realise that you don't need to be a gamer to love the notion of choice and storytelling. And I think so as soon as we can access that, and it's not like, our subscriptions giving us access to great interactive content and we have the means, I do think there'll be, but I say that's 5 years away really. I love the set up the platforms now for content, much more than them set up the platforms. It's about having a network, particularly Wi-Fi networks, which can sustain that so it's a seamless experience. And also, it is coming, but unfortunately it's not being driven by our plans.
Yeah, I think, I absolutely agree with you, but I also think that conceptually we haven't explored that space enough yet. And again, because it is expensive, right? You do need to have the equipment to run it. You do need to have access to someone who can do it, and not everybody can, create a VR environment. And the way the funding is working, it's quite difficult to actually get funding for something that would be purely experimental, purely innovative. So we don't really necessarily have the experimentation to actually fully understand that space and fully describe that space. And I do think the only way for this to actually happen is to have a YouTube, approach to VR, where members of the public, people who have passion, who have ideas, who don't necessarily require funding, can start to populate, populate a library of virtual spaces that other people can start to interact with and work with to actually maybe pioneer some new interaction, pioneer some new ways of telling stories, pioneer new ways of correlating different things together, and then help develop what could be a canon of practices in this area. But unless that comes into play, I think it's going to take us some time. If you think about like the way cinema works, or for instance, it's when people were able to actually start to make their own movies that new principles were being written, were being accepted and were being disseminated. We're not there yet because technologically speaking, we haven't got that mass, the way of actually sharing information, sharing VR spaces en masse for the people to explore.
It's interesting as well, it's not something like a car is expensive, but we sort of need a car. But there's very few VR experiences that you went, I need that. I'm just literally going to go and I'm going to put my hand in my pocket and use 700 quid, or I'm going to take out a wee loan because I just need that. Do you know what I mean? But it's funny, isn't it?
There's something, because I agree with what you're saying, that these sorts of projects fall in a gap of funding, because they're not pushing technology forward and they're not artistic in a traditional sense, and that's really problematic. But I think we're seeing a kind of rise in people being more interested in investing in experiences. So I think most musicians they're making more money out of gigs and festivals than they are out of selling their music now. Though I'm not an expert on this, so I'm making up words for the claim it's not supported there. But you also see with the things like the rise of punch drunk and secret cinema and these sorts of people are willing to spend their money on experiences. So then we have an opportunity, perhaps, to prototype and develop by, I guess, leveraging that in some ways. So, thinking maybe less about funding things in traditional ways and looking at maybe, I want to say crowdfunding, but maybe looking at other ways of funding what we're doing. And I feel really very lucky because I'm in an academic position that allows me a little bit of time to play. And a little bit of time to try things out. Not as much as I would like, but no one ever gets as much as they would like. So I think as academics we also have a bit of responsibility to challenge the tried and tested modes that we've been using in games forever because they're commercially safe. And to slowly try to nudge what's happening in a different way. And I think we're we're seeing that with a lot of independent game designers or part-time academics now, start to see that relationship. So hopefully we've got a role to play as academics, but then also maybe we've got a responsibility to help support people that are out there doing interesting things, to find the money, to find the funding to do larger scale things, because what we're doing without funding in the academic institution is not going to change the culture anytime soon. So it does need bigger intervention.
And maybe actually support the work rather than the technology, like have a place where you can rent your VR headset and then pay for the games. Like, because if the technology were was less expensive, then we'd have more money to actually invest in experiencing content, in experiencing in buying art VR projects or MR projects or AR projects. If the technology is there and you can rent it rather than buy it, maybe that's...
So also making it accessible, because I think when you were talking about YouTube, I was thinking about itch, there's lots of really great stuff on itch, but how do you find it?
Yeah.
And the same with Steam, all the platforms for games and interactive media are so saturated that actually accessibility, finding things, tagging, searching, this stuff's really difficult, and I would say it's probably really hard on YouTube, but for some reason I find YouTube more accessible, easier to find what I'm looking for than these other platforms, but maybe it's because of the language.
It would also be cool, because the reason I migrated to Blu-ray DVD was because my PlayStation 3 at the time came from Blu-ray DVD player. So what could, and the PlayStations are sold at their price because they know the game sales are all made them back. So the way to do it with PlayStation 5 comes with PSVR just inbuilt in it at 350 quid. So it's there. Because I think it's almost like, that's the way hardware usually works, isn't it? You should give it to people so the actual content pays for it, but that isn't the case with VR at the moment, interestingly.
I wonder, just sort of follow up, because this is funded by the Royal Society, hopefully they're listening. I think this is exactly the kind of thing they're really hoping we'll identify actually. There is this funding gap, and I think this is exactly the kind of niche which Scotland can exploit, because we do have all of these great creative sector and these kinds of institutions and loads of museums who are really excited about being venues and other cultural institutions, but I'm an archaeologist, so I'm the same museums. They're really excited about hosting this kind of stuff, so I wonder whether there's that thing you've all collectively hit on the gem of a really incredible idea, but essentially. So hopefully the Scottish Government is listening. I believe they fund these kinds of things. Release of funding. Right?
I think the migration of brands and talent, which isn't necessarily associated with the digital space into it. So, if David Lynch's next film was only on VR, you would find a massive uptake.
Yeah.
I mean, Bjork does that, which is a huge credit to her, she'll release an album and it's digital stuff, and I think if we could propagate that in Scotland, that'd be amazing, because actually I think we do need to align talent to, and not pigeonhole them as, he's a filmmaker, he's a writer. Just actually get them in, get Michelle Faber to come and make him do stuff, because actually I know they'll all be interested. It's just probably no one's knocking on the door asking them,
I think National Theatre Scotland are trying to do that, and they're trying to bring people together to explore
they're doing it.
potential.
They've got that Citizen and Aware project, which is trying to...
It's a little bit of it, but maybe more.
I think that one of the themes that's emerged is this fascination with VR, probably because it's the most immersive, if one uses this word in inverted commas of the time. For instance, we mentioned the theme parks earlier, and this natural go-to place, and yet having just returned from Alton Towers, excited to see how their VR roller coaster adaptation went. I didn't know until I got there that they discontinued it, and they discontinued it because they ran it on what was the Air roller coaster years and years ago. Do people in VR, because that's the natural thing to do, you get the full sensory experience and VR, and eventually put just the back row and put people into two queues, and no one was in that queue, so they asked people, and people said, don't want to do that. I'm on a roller coaster, and you're limiting my experience. So there's this fascination with VR can sometimes be the problem. And I think something that's coming out here is that the need for funding, and what the HRC has put money into in the last couple of years in particular, is appreciating this need for process, like this understanding that if there's a story to tell or an idea to fulfill, although the technology can create a constraint which is useful. In my experience, certainly, is people have come in and said, we want to do something in VR. And we say, well, what's the idea? No, I don't know yet. It's VR. And that's quite an unhelpful thing. But often what's happening in a lot of these projects is that it's turned out, and this is a serious game space and other spaces as well, the solution was actually the iPhone, and they already had one in their hand already, and they had it for 10 years. And it was by far the best platform for doing the storytelling they wanted to do, they just didn't see it. So I think that that's probably the kind of thing we should be looking at, is that VR is really good for creating headlines, but it has kind of stalled. You hit on augmented reality, Sandy, and I think that's something we'll see more and more of. It did have Pokemon Go in 2016, 2017, whenever that was, it was like a big breakout hit, and then the cookie cutter thing that I mentioned came into play, and there was loads of them, and then it didn't make any sense anymore. But something I alluded to though is, which is coming, is 5G, and I've been getting texts on my phone all week from EE saying, you're getting your 5G soon, and that could be the potential to unlock a little bit more of augmented reality, mixed reality experiences, more so than VR headsets.
But I still do think that we need to find a way to get user-generated content into those space. Once you start to do this, then you're starting to create a need. You're starting to create that need to actually be part of it. And we're not quite there yet. But if you think about, I always like to think about where we were 5-10 years ago, right? 5 years ago, 10 years ago, if you wanted to make a game, or any kind of like game experience or VR experience, you had to be a programmer. You didn't really have to actually do this. Nowadays, you can make a VR experiment and not write a single line of code, right? Potentially. If you wanted to create proprietary 3D modeling a few years ago, you needed some proper skills in 3D modeling. The tools are becoming a lot easier to use. Now, give it another 5 or 10 years, you might be able to, there's so much content being generated, you might be able to actually be able to generate your own VR experience with your own 3D models, and not necessarily need to be a computer scientist bundled into a 3D artist. So maybe you will come back again.
So why VR? Why does it have to be VR? Like 1,000 kids holding up their wands in front of all the banners. Those are the really strong narrative experiences, people coming together. Does it really need to be VR?
I think VR is a stopgap. I think VR is a stopgap to AR. And what we all want really is the glasses, not even the glasses, just the 100 ripples. But yeah, I don't think VR is a stopgap.
Can I ask about that? That you brought up a few points. You brought up stuff about intergenerational before, you brought stuff about being out of the museum, and now you talk about why VR. Can we talk a bit more about why you would do something in a virtual space, what possibilities it gives you, like museums that archive so much stuff and running out of storage space and you can't access half the stuff that you want to see. People who are in nursing homes and they can't get to see those exhibitions and get out there, but they want different kinds of experiences in those spaces. Intergenerational play between grandkids and grandparents. At the moment they can have a certain amount on Skype or FaceTime. What can we be offering in those spaces? What can we be offering around health and well-being? What you're doing is about play and movement, mobility, all those kind of things that I think are the perfect reason to be in a virtual space, and they rarely get spoken about.
Do you remember the experiments in 3D web back in the days? I say this is a complete tangent, but it's relevant. I think the reason virtual space is brilliant is because as people were good at navigating 3D spaces. And I remember they were trying to do that with the web and 3D web thing, or I think that's what it was called, but there was this idea of, how can we, but the web ultimately just became around sort of links and tabs and stuff like that, and specific, but actually, and that's the huge value of sort of archiving stuff in 3D space, because we can mind map stuff in 3D space better than in other ways. Like one of the games across here, but one of the games I was looking at over there was a guy who sort of, his dog had died a year back, and he decided what he wanted to do was capture all of the memories that his family had about this pet and infuse them into a replica digital space of his home. And actually, there was something pretty beautiful about that, because, how nice would that be about, if you could commoditize that, and this is the YouTube thing. If at the point when my gran was 95 and we knew she only had a few weeks left to live, and capture that, just all get out sort of stories and create that in a navigatable 3D space. Because if you think about it, I've got 4,000 pictures on my phone, and if somebody says, oh, have you got that picture? I can't find it. I'm just like, oh, it's not on this one, it's on another phone. There's something beautiful about virtual space, that way we naturally feel at home in it. And I do think there's something lovely about VR and AR in that sense. And I'm just going to say one thing before I forget it. I actually think theatre has all the answers anyway, because street theatre is augmented reality. You know, it goes out, it intrudes in the space we know. Traditional stage-based theatre is virtual reality. It is a space we're taken out of it and we're boxed in. You know, ultimately it starts and all you've got is you've got empty space and then it's intruded. And I think so there are two flip sides. If you want to do stage-based theatre, it's virtual reality. If you want to do street arts and street theatre,
what about people who can't get out into the street? I suppose you've got an opportunity with virtual reality around accessibility.
Exactly. Yes,
I see the value of street theatre and theatre, and I know everything that theatre can bring. I'm happy to take that to a space when somebody can't get out of their Lisbon home door. They can't travel to see the people they want to see. They want to revisit those exhibitions that they visited previously. How they've got one object from a home that used to be a 10-room home, and they've only got one object to remember by. What are those opportunities that aren't being exploited? And is that where you're saying the funding gap is, that's why you don't go into that space? Or is it because the commercial imperatives then you never even think about those spaces?
I think it's really interesting because there's two different things there. There's virtual space and there's virtual reality. And I think there's a massive difference between them. Virtual reality, I think, is very isolating in that you can't at the moment share that space.
You can with other people in virtual reality. So, you know, if we're in the same room and we both put headsets and we can be in the same digital space. Or we can be 100 miles apart and still be in the same digital space. So,
but are we?
I mean, that's Facebook's pitch, isn't it? It reunites people in a virtual space, and that's why I bought into Oculus, and I thought, yeah, we can bring people together and can't get out. I suppose what I was saying about street theatre and stage is they provide the answers for digital space. I'm not saying that's a solution, because they're 100% with you. I think the idea of this being able to transport, being able to take somebody who's bedridden out into the streets again is absolutely incredible. And I do think that there's huge scope for that. And again, I think that's been tied in a lot with what Oculus and Facebook are trying. I think they're good in that space actually. I think they've hit criticism because of it, because when people saw it, it's just like, well, they're the avatars, I mean, well, that's it. But you look, people weren't looking past what were actually really being handed on a plate there, I think.
But I think a lot of the VR application is in tourism actually, and like visiting places you can't normally access and going to places you can't normally bring to rather than games. And I think people have been saying this for a while now, that that's where their actual usefulness comes into place, like giving that experience to somebody who can't actually get that experience.
The tape did that thing where you could take control of a robot in its archive and go around and look at its archive now. That's pretty cool. You don't need to virtually create the thing.
But I do think that this discussion, we need to have a discussion in relation to what's available in terms of hardware. So we're going back to the technology again. Because it is very complicated. If you're going to create an immersive VR experiment that you want to share with people, you need to have a kit to run it. It's not just a headset. You need to have the PC that's going to run it with the right type of graphic cards. You need to have, if you're using your phone, you need to have the right type of phone, the right type of connection, all these kind of things. So I don't think the hardware is necessarily available widely enough to be able to. So you can do all these things, but I think they become more events or localized thing, like events, that rather than something that is shared across the whole society.
I think it picks up on what Robin was saying about we've also been talking about funding opportunities for this sort of thing. I think that as soon as we take games technology and what we do and place it into that space. You know, if we start to collaborate with the NHS or, you know, a certain fund, then all of a sudden it opens up doors to explore these. And I know that you know, we've had lots of projects in some sort of serious game space. We've had lots of people from outside games come to us and we explore it together. And there is pots of money to the proof of concept stage, but then pushing beyond that to roll it out more widely, rolling technologies, the limitation, as you say, getting into these spaces, but also the funding because proof of concept's fairly inexpensive to do one of the sort of projects you're suggesting, but then to actually make it into a viable product that can be rolled out on the App Store or something like that, it's a huge leap, and it's something that would need, I guess, a commercial company to buy in. And unfortunately, this well-being kind of space, I would say commercial companies in the games realm, they're not there, they're not thinking about that, they're thinking about entertainment, you know. And then we fall back into this problem that Simon was talking about in terms of being able to access big enough pots of money to make these ideas real. And that's maybe where actually we need to just start to think less about technically complex solutions and more about layering on solutions that are already there. So as you were saying, Skype, you know, so how can we do plugins or how can we do things that layer on top of Skype that then, you know, it's in an environment people are comfortable with that allow them to do more. You know, so Snapchat is a camera app, but it's got these filters and people love it, right? But it's a very simple thing, and it connects people. I know that my mother-in-law, who's not technically minded at all, loves to do that and helps her connect with her 15-year-old nephew. You know, because it's a simple thing that they will get. So actually, maybe we want to be looking at these kind of things we can lay on existing technologies for now. I know this isn't very innovative, but how can that then help people connect? How can it enable people who don't have mobility? How, you know, it's totally possible. And I think what some of the really interesting uses of CG and 3D technology is trying to capture things that are disappearing. So trying to capture, I went to this talk about, there's a particular form of martial arts that only one person in the world knows about now. And you're trying to capture all of that information, that physical data through motion capture and things before it's gone from the world. Do you know, and actually then if we build up libraries of these things, then they can be made personal to people, but then they can also form archives that can benefit us all. I went on a little bit of a tangent there.
It's quite interesting that you brought the subject of archives, because when we are dealing with technology, it's becoming much more complicated. You know, you might be. It's also about continuing support and everything. So if you develop a nice health game, you know, that's released on, I don't know, the iPhone or something. Your funding is only for 3 or 4 years. Your funding's run out. iPhone changed their operating system. Your game doesn't work anymore. It's not available anymore. That's gone. So, you know, these are the type of issues that I think we need to think about. We start to talk about potential future impact, and we're talking about impact before impact of your research or impact of what you're doing. You need to take those things into consideration when you start to think about technologies, sort of like sensitive type of areas. I've got a couple of game consoles at home. I can't play them because modern TVs don't allow me to plug them anywhere, and I've got no way of actually. And I know they still work, but I can't test them. I can't try them unless I find a note. You know. And I think that's also part of the issue there. You know, if you could have a research project and buy 200 phones for you know, a serious game, kind of like intervention. Well, 2 years later, those phones they are not, you know, they are obsolete in a way, and you kind of like lost that. So you can't really roll out, you know, unless you get more funding, and so that whole notion of being dependent on technology, I think, is something that is worth thinking in terms, especially in terms of VR. I mean, how much is the VR?
Yeah, they're still very, as Simon was saying, if you bundle it with something people buy, but people are not flocking out to buy these headsets, whether they're £200 or £1,000. I think one of the things you mentioned there, but to kind of finish up, it's a good place to wrap up, is it's very easy to look at virtual reality and see it's a new thing, but from a game developer's perspective, 99% of what's happening in VR is exactly the exact same way that we would deliver it to screen. We've just turned on the VR button. And the sun gives a nice analogy, it's a neck controller. And actually for a lot of the things we're building, as I was saying, you go back to a monitor screen or a TV screen or a mobile phone, it's actually a better output display for the thing that we've built in VR. So VR is a little bit, in comparison to red herring, it's a little bit red herring in that sense, and it is just another display. And actually for a lot of the things we've tried so far, it's not as good a display, because we're just adapting the wrong thing. We're not actually transforming it in any way. So you can be just as immersive with Skype, you can be just as immersive with Google Maps, you can be just as immersive with playing something on your phone as you could do with VR, unless you've got a really good reason for doing something that's kind of neck-based input device, in which case everything else about connecting across generations, connecting across continents, applies uniformly to every other display as well. VR is just a neck controller. I think that's probably a good output.
I think you hit the nail, the nail on the head there is, we use VR, and the first thing we do is a first-person shooter. First-person shooters work because of the controls you've got, right? You don't have those controls in VR, so that's probably the wrong example. The wrong thing to try to actually do. The type of thing you're talking about are actually spot on. That's probably what we should be doing. Let's develop some immersive environments that allow people to revisit memories, to explore places where they can't go. Maybe that's the type of thing we should be showcasing. No, another first-person shooter that doesn't work as well.
Maybe going back to what play really is, rather than play always being seen about competition in the games sector, or gambling in the games sector, or risk in the games sector, where play, intergenerational play before is all about learning about your environment, socialising, mobility, risk-taking in a different way. And I think those who are combining those virtual and real experiences are very aware of that already, but it doesn't seem to translate from people who are used to just screen-based or console-based play to that idea of fuller experience of what show and tell could be.
I think, just to wrap up, because we're kind of coming at the end now, but I think there are certainly opportunities for funding, and they're being driven by virtual reality as a predominant technology that's leading that drive. If you look at things like accessibility, I think some of the things we've displayed earlier today were more accessible than virtual reality, often with wider audiences in mind. If you look at what the big technology manufacturers are working on, PlayStation released PlayStation VR, that Microsoft's released the accessibility controller, and it's probably not as well known or understood. It's a really good piece of kit for bringing in many more players and allowing for custom controllers to be built effectively. There's probably as much mileage in that, but we don't really see it. But one of the things we could be doing, if we're looking at funders, is using this interest, because there is definite interest in immersive just now, it's been driven by VR, to say, well, what are the actual problems we want to solve? And now we have a really big toolkit of things, one of which is VR. But there's many other approaches as well, or multimedia. In fact, if you consult me, you should call it multimedia. It's a multimedia approach, a multi-platform approach. We've had many ideas today, Sam, we've harvested net controller multimedia. It's revolutionary. But I think that's where we could be looking, is to actually use that interest and that knowledge that there are these new technologies to say, well, actually, you know what, there's also this mixed bag. There's also the phone you've still got in your hand that it can do a lot of things, and you know what, many phones can be turned into VR. A lot of people not necessarily turn to that other than early adopters, but you could do VR, you could do AR with phones, or you could use customized controllers. I think that's kind of a good wrap-up point there. I'm conscious that it is 6 o'clock and we're going to be kicked out of this room imminently because of a Kaylee, I think. Yeah, so there you go, unless we stay for a Kaylee. So I'd like to take this opportunity just to thank Sandy, Simon, Mona, and Lynn, and also thank you all for coming. Thank you very much. Now all our tech support is live. So free camera for whoever wants it.
Was that going to capture up the project?
Thank you.
Yeah.